Hi there. I hope that you're having a great week. We are definitely moving right along with the quarter, and now we're in the sixth week. So we're about halfway through, and we've got some new ideas to cover. This week's discussion is going to be surrounding the issue of what it means to engage in listening as it relates to a lot of social and political issues. Definitely a challenging and certainly timely area for us to focus on for this week. So let's get started. This week, our goal is to understand how listening connects to political and social issues. The reading that I'm asking you to complete for this week is pretty straightforward and not a super long assignment, but it is one that connects pretty closely to some ideas such as the public sphere and public screen that we'll be getting into for some context on it before we dive in. We'll also understand why the public sphere is relevant to listening and what it has to offer as we think about a lot of these social and political issues. And lastly, we'll apply those listening skills to understand the four major categories that are laid out in this article. Just as a reminder, for this week, you do have a quiz covering the content from this week's article, but you do not have a regular weekly activity. Instead, I'm asking you to complete that first essay assignment by Sunday if you haven't done so already. This week's reading comes from Dr. Carolyn Hendricks, who is a professor at the Crawford School of Public Policy and is in many ways an expert when it comes to trying to understand and think about how we think about listening and engagement with others from a politics perspective. In particular, Hendricks has written a variety of books about things such as public deliberation and has been very much concerned with the way that we as people can engage in social and political issues and attempt to communicate as a way to resolve or engage with a lot of these challenging kinds of topics. To kind of give you the overall thesis or takeaway from this week's reading, I think Hendricks does a great job of setting up in this piece the core idea that listening, when we think about a lot of challenging social and political issues, oftentimes an area where we find ourselves unable to meet with or to agree with other people, and oftentimes a source of a lot of discomfort for us. We oftentimes feel tense or uncomfortable when we find ourselves in those kinds of disagreements with others, definitely more so in recent years than in the past. When we find ourselves in these types of situations, we need to think about listening. As we've been talking about so far in the class, there are a lot of times where listening is just assumed to be a thing that we do, but not a thing that we really engage with very closely from a content perspective. We're told, for instance, that when we are in business and professional settings, we should listen, but we're never really told how to listen or what to do. So listening is also something we need to think about a little bit more closely in some of these issues too. That is, when we listen to perspectives that are supportive or similar to us, or we choose to listen to people that are members of opposing and different groups, in both of those situations, they have important functions and uses for us in our society. We oftentimes have this stereotype that listening to people like us is just an echo chamber, it doesn't do anything. Or that listening to other people just means that we shut down and disengage or get nothing out of it. But this week's reading from Hendricks really suggests that there's opportunities for listening despite similarities or differences that we might have. One of the core ideas here that gets brought into this week's reading that's helpful, and might be something you're familiar with, is the idea of polarization. This is something that has been talked about a lot in the context of politics. One example that I wanted to show comes from the Pew Research Center, which over the years has been tracking political leanings, ideology, and divisions in the United States by political party. And it's probably not a surprise to find that over the years, they found that there are greater ideological divisions and disagreements between people on the basis of political party. From 1994, 2004 to 2014, and probably even more so as we get into 2024. This is not to say that polarization is necessarily a bad thing or that each party has gotten more extreme necessarily, just to say that each party is much more different than the other in the way that things have progressed over the years. In fact, you'll also notice that there's that middle area, people that might be more moderate politically, that has also shrunk over the years, showing us that there's a lot bigger divides on the basis of political party that's happened over time. Polarization, as we know, is a really challenging and important issue for us to think about. Polarization includes a lot of different elements. For instance, the idea that people are going to move to opposing positions or perspectives on a variety of different issues. The idea that people who are involved in groups might characterize or treat people outside of the group more negatively, that you're not a part of my group or my circle. And that there's less space for people in between or less space in the middle. Not to suggest, of course, that there aren't opportunities outside of that as well. In the United States, there are additional parties outside of the two-party system or people who would consider themselves to be independent. One idea in political science that I think is useful to characterize and think about this is what's known as Duverger's law. And this comes from political science, and it's the central thesis that under a winner-take-all political system, you're more likely to have two parties. There's a simple reason for this. If the winner or the one that has the plurality, the most votes out of the candidates, wins, then various groups and organizations are more likely to try to merge and coalesce together to create one candidate that's the most compelling or the best option compared to the alternative. It's a lot better to have one candidate with a broader range of support from different groups than to have a bunch of different candidates, all of which would lose. So there's oftentimes a race to consolidate. If you think about, for instance, the 2008 presidential primary in the United States and the Democratic Party, it was probably one of the tightest primaries in history between Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. When Obama won that primary, there was an effort to try to consolidate and to gain the support of people that supported Clinton in that primary. So that's an example of some of the ways that consolidation happens under political polarization. Meanwhile, in countries, including those in Western Europe, oftentimes they have what's known as a proportional representation system, where voters will vote for parties and the percentage of support that a party receives corresponds to the number of seats that it gets. This is why you'll oftentimes get political parties such as the Pirate Party that wind up only getting like 3% of the vote, but actually get representation. All of this to say that the political structure and organization of the United States is incentivized such that there are two major political parties that are oftentimes leading to a lot of social divisions. As a result of polarization, we can see a lot of different challenges and issues that might come up. One of them being that people with similar perspectives or approaches are more likely to reinforce each other, that we oftentimes will find populations that are similar to us, and oftentimes we'll find ourselves reaffirming our views. Another idea here is that polarization oftentimes leads us to believe that outsiders or people that disagree with us are a lot more hostile or dangerous, that they pose a greater threat than otherwise. And lastly, that it's much more difficult to understand or to listen to outside perspectives too. There's a lot of situations where it can feel like you're talking to somebody and they're speaking a totally different language, or your values or beliefs are so fundamentally different that it can be difficult to connect. So those are important considerations related to issues of polarization in politics. And another important consideration are the ways that different spheres impact communication. If you've taken a class in something like public speaking, you might be familiar with these different types of spheres. Thomas Goodnight theorizes that there's 3 different spheres that can explain the way people behave. The private sphere is a context where we communicate that's like your internal dialogue, like you're talking to yourself in the mirror to pump yourself up for work, or you're talking to a close friend or family member. It's very tight-knit. A technical sphere is a little bit more exclusive than everybody, but it typically involves a group of experts. For instance, if you're involved with some type of extracurricular or activity or organization or community, you're in a technical sphere. You're with a population of people that shares some level of view or similarity on issues, but there's exclusion happening. And then lastly, a public sphere deals with a much broader group. Generally speaking, the public sphere could be anyone. So if you get yourself a TV ad, then that's a good example of the public sphere, that ad is intended for a large audience, although there are probably some algorithms that they use to try to target you specifically. Or something like a speech, right? Like a presidential address would be an example of communication that attempts to reach the public sphere. So when this reading and Hendricks is talking about the public sphere, it's under the assumption that there is this broad group or population to whom they intend to speak. Another key person to know, and the creator of this idea of the public sphere, was Jürgen Habermas, who wrote about and theorized the public sphere in his book, The Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere. One thing that I think is important to know as we're thinking about how the public sphere was originally theorized, right, was that it came from a perspective that the public, or the people that would deliberate the issues of the day, were bourgeois. They represented the elite or people with financial influence. In this way, it was almost a sort of oligarchy of people who were able to communicate. Obviously, I don't think this is a good model for thinking about how public deliberation happens now. It's definitely opened up. So it's important to think about the public sphere more as an open space for communication for people from a variety of different backgrounds, even though it was originally theorized more as people with privilege or power. And the public sphere was initially theorized under the belief that democracy would win, that by us having these open discussions, this sort of place where people were talking about the issues of the day in the town square, right? That there's an assumption at the time that that would lead to people reaching the correct conclusion. This goes all the way back to the Greeks and the idea of dialectic, right? That dialogue and discussion would lead people toward the truth, or would lead people toward a good conclusion. We oftentimes have not seen that at present, where we still retain a lot of divisions, even though we debate. And oftentimes we could leave ourselves feeling more frustrated than where we started. So the public sphere has definitely generated some criticism regarding the ways that its communication can happen. Another idea and another complication comes from Dr. Kevin DeLuca, who's a communication scholar and environmental studies theorist who talks about the ways that we've oftentimes shifted from public sphere to public screen, or the ways that we use social media, the internet, or even television in a way that impacts how we receive messages and talk about issues. We're not just talking in the town square. We're using things such as social media to communicate about or share issues through channels like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and so on. We're also using those online spaces to learn about or to engage with topics. We use media framing or agenda setting to communicate and understand a message. When you're reading a news headline, right, there is a frame here. There is what's included in the frame, how the issue is being discussed, and various topics that are not in the headlines or not in the news in the same way. So another thing to think about is agenda setting. What are the important topics or issues being talked about? And how do things such as polarization impact the process? If you look at headlines on Fox News and MSNBC, you're probably going to see very different sets of headlines, which again contributes to a lot of the challenges that we feel with listening and polarization. So media plays a major role in thinking about the ways that we can listen and engage on social and political issues, especially when it leads to us viewing a lot of topics very differently. For this week's reading, they look at the case study of the Narrabee Gas Project. And this is an interesting case study to look at because it explores some of the ways that people listen differently. This is a case of natural gas resources in Australia. And you might draw parallels to things such as the Dakota Access Pipeline and similar opportunities for things like offshore drilling, right? Where there's oftentimes a debate among environmental advocates and activists who believe that the land should be preserved, or indigenous groups who find themselves opposed to using land for natural gas, and people involved in business or companies that see extraction of the natural gas as a good thing to do. So this is a case where by exploring this project, the authors are able to understand the ways that different forms of listening happen. So these authors suggest 4 different modes of listening And I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about each of them because I think they're core parts of the argument, and I think are useful for us to understand how listening is happening here. These four types of listening are enclave listening, alliance listening, adversarial listening, and transformative listening. Let's start first with enclave listening. This could be what oftentimes we characterize as an echo chamber. So if you have environmental protesters who are all together and listening and agree with each other, we might think that that doesn't do a whole lot or serve a whole lot. But actually, Hendricks says, hang on, enclave listening or listening among like-minded groups can actually be really useful because it helps us to build this idea of solidarity, of feeling together, of feeling united, of having a common cause or belief that members of the group hold that's important and is shared. So enclave listening can be useful for members of a group to build their perspective and also to feel a connection and support among others that could help them in gaining perhaps the confidence or ability to achieve what they want to do. So in this way, this form of listening is very much focused on empowering the individual members of the group toward the ends that they find important. Secondarily is the idea of alliance listening. Alliance listening means that you're listening among groups that have some similarities, but are not maybe the exact same people. For instance, alliance listening could involve organizations that maybe do care about the environment, but aren't as familiar with this specific case study. To give you a historical example, in the work to lead to the ultimate passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990, which provides reasonable accommodation on the basis of disability, one thing that was done in San Francisco was a sit-in where folks with disabilities occupied the state space in order to make their case for disability rights. And they actually formed an alliance with the Black Panthers in the area, who were able to supply food and resources that let folks with disabilities stay and continue the occupation. So this is an example of the ways that alliances can be formed. They're not necessarily the exact same parties with the exact same beliefs, but that crossover allows groups to work together. Not everybody agrees. In fact, there might be sources of disagreement, but listening is focused on finding those points of overlap between social and political groups. The third type of listening is this idea of adversarial listening. You can think about this type as knowing your enemy, right? Taking notes and tracking or monitoring the activities of people that you disagree with. Oftentimes when we find ourselves arguing or debating or disagreeing, we can do so from a more informed perspective when we more fully understand the perspectives of people that we disagree with. We get to develop counter arguments. We get to hear from, or maybe even change our views on a few different things. But that we're listening for the sake of strategy and the sake of understanding what the other side has to say. And then lastly is the idea of transformative listening. This means that we listen to the broader public in order to change the public's view or change the overall perspective that populations have on an issue. One example of this is in inserting ideas or using things that get added to the broader public as part of the overall conversation. A really good example of this are the ways that things such as Twitter hashtags will go viral or gain attention, where people will create those hashtags and create a broader social and cultural understanding using that medium. For instance, one example I'd give, pictured here on the right, is hashtag walk in red. One thing that's been noted and really observed in a lot of spaces surrounding discussion of autism is that a lot of autistic non-binary folks and women are oftentimes underrepresented or left out of the discussion. So hashtag walk in red emerged for autistic women and non-binary people to wear the color red to spotlight and highlight their underrepresentation comparatively when discussing autism and related issues. So that would be an example of using a hashtag as a form of transformational listening to get people engaged in thinking about a topic in a way that they might not have otherwise. So these four forms of listening are ways that it's suggested that we can think about and engage on these social and political issues that go beyond just listening to people similar to us and opposing people unlike us. So to wrap up some of the things that we went over for this week, We talked a little bit about polarization, civil unrest, and some of these core ideas surrounding things such as the public sphere. We also talked about some of the listening strategies, including these 4 approaches that Hendricks lays out that help us to think about social and political issues. We also talked about some of the ways that listening serves important functions in order for us to participate and to engage with groups effectively. All told, right, this helps us to think about a lot of these contemporary issues and the way that listening can connect to them pretty succinctly. For next week, we are going to be looking at the importance of issues of race and how race and other related topics connect to listening. So this is an important and a challenging area of discussion, but I think will be a useful one as we continue to explore some of the issues related to listening. So have a great week. Best of luck with wrapping up this essay assignment. And I look forward to talking with you again next week.